Hello. Let's see. Where are we? We're at Sunday. It's a little bit before 12 noon. We're getting started a little late. Welcome to Sunshine and Transparency. Now, what are we about? Well, we're a podcast. I'm a relatively old guy, and we discuss each week different topics. And frankly, they've been topics that I was curious of years ago when I was in college. And I don't even want to tell you the decade. Well, I'll tell you the decade, 1960s and 70s primarily. That's a long time ago. So today we're going to talk about the price of money. And what is the price of money? The price of money. Isn't that an interesting sort of an introduction? Today we have cryptocurrency, and there's no price to cryptocurrency, yet it's trying to take the place of money, of what we call fiat currency, which is our money. And gold for years has taken the place of money, fiat money, and gold has survived as a value and an exchange value for centuries, not just years, going back at least almost 3 centuries. It's been relied on gold coins in the Byzantine Empire. But what is the price of money? Neither gold nor cryptocurrency have a price. Okay. There's no variance in their price. Well, the price of money is the interest rate. That's what money costs. If a person wants to buy money, if it were as if it were a regular commodity, they would have to pay the interest rate. So today we're going to talk about that and the importance of it. Now, last week we talked about the interest rate in a more narrow context. And this week we're going to expand it and look at primarily how the government has manipulated the price of money, the interest rate, and why, and under what conditions. And we're going to go back and look at it. Now, I'll tell you, I could have never written it this week, but I posted a paper. Paper will be online called The Price of Money. Now, it's a 36-page paper, okay? Many of you aren't going to have time to read it. However, what I'd encourage you to do is to read the executive summary, which I'm going to read out right now on page 1, to read the last paragraph on page 30, and then I'd encourage you to go to page 36 to see this graph. Okay. Now, this graph is on page 36 of the paper that will be on the website later this afternoon. And what it shows is every time we borrow a dollar, what is the effect of that borrowed dollar on our growth? Does that borrowed dollar convert 1-to-1 to growth? In other words, when we go in debt and we borrow a dollar, we being the country, the US government. Now, it's a different deal when we borrow a dollar, we run up a credit card bill or that type of thing. That's a different world. But when we borrow a dollar, the federal government, does that dollar that we borrow, that $1, does that result in a dollar of growth? Well, the graph says no. The graph says that back in 1965, when we borrowed a dollar in 1965, now that's almost 60 years ago, right? 59 years ago. It resulted in 89 cents of growth. Now we have those numbers. We have the GDP. There are other influences in the GDP, so you have to be careful about it. And we have the borrowing every year. We know what we borrow. So we can see if we borrowed and then the GDP, did it go up that much, or what caused the GDP to go up? Okay, so it's more complicated than that, but that's sort of a simplistic way to look at it. Did that borrowed dollar result in a dollar of growth? And if not, why did we borrow? I mean, it's a little bit stupid to borrow money you owe if you don't get growth out of that money. So we see in the 0 hour graph, we see in 1965, 59 years ago, $1 borrowed resulted in 89 cents of growth. 89 cents, not 90. Now that goes up and down over the years. But when we fast forward to 2002, it resulted in 18 cents of growth. And you can see the line actually is headed to zero. Okay. And that was in 2002. So in theory, if that line holds true, we can borrow an infinite amount of dollars at some point, and it will result in zero growth, zero. That's not good. That's not good because we have to pay it back if we want credibility. If we don't want to become like Argentina or a number of other countries that have defaulted on their debt. Because when you default on your debt, what happens when you tell them, oh, up yours, we're not paying it back? Your currency drops significantly. I'm not going to say it goes to zero, but in Argentina, that has happened. And since 2001, when the Argentine peso was equal to the dollar, 1-to-1, the Argentine peso now is worth less than a penny, less than a penny. And they've had years of reneging on their debt. So it's not a good idea. You can imagine the inflation that's ensued. And I think right now, the average inflation in Argentina is above 50% a year. Now, we had 9%, and look at how it dislocated so many Americans. Just 9%. Over 3 years, we've had about 20%, 21% in our decline in our buying power. Can you imagine what 50% would do? It will be horrific. So this is an important discussion. And guess what? Neither political party is holding it. They're not saying anything about, oh, of course, Harris and Walsh are talking about increasing the corporate tax rate to 28%, increasing the long-term gain percentage to 44.5%, assessing a tax on capital on any gain in the system of 25%. But there's such ignoramuses. I don't mean to pick on them. I'm going to get to Trump too. He's an ignoramus too. He's not alone. There's such ignoramuses. They don't know they would tank the GDP, the gross domestic product. They would tank it if they tried to implement even one of those three, let alone all three. They're just utter absolute nonsense. That doesn't mean the tax code doesn't need to be trashed. The whole code does, not just amended in those three areas to try to gouge money out of a society. No, that will tank the growth. That's the stupidest thing. I can't imagine you'd find an economist, even the Marxists have a hard time defending that. Marx couldn't even do his transformation tables right. They don't make mathematical sense to a fourth grader to figure out that he can't add. But that's another story. So basically, we have a problem in America today. And the price of money is just the superficial edge of the problem. The problem has been, and the paper goes into it in some depth. I'm going to read you the executive summary to the paper. And this is a bit of a study thing. If you want to take some notes, you're welcome to. But you'll have the paper on the website itself by this evening. Now, the paper is intended to show that traditional Keynesian fiscal and monetary stimulus don't work in high debt environments. In other words, when the country is in high debt, it's not as effective to print more money and to borrow more money. Number two, the Federal Reserve's reliance on expanding debt to reflate recessions through discounted and negative federal funds rates over time has derogatory consequences for wealth and societal welfare. Derogatory consequences. So when you rely on lowering the interest rate or raising the interest rate solely and printing, when you lower the interest rate to re-stimulate the economy, which is what we did massively in a bit in 2018, then again in 2021 to a level I've never seen in my whole life. As a matter of fact, we grew the money in circulation, M2, up almost 30% from 2017 to 2021, the beginning of 2022. Is there any wonder we had inflation? Of course not. It's not a commodity shortage, which the idiot economists and government, it wasn't that. The government was printing money like banshees. You can't expect your money to keep at the same buying power when they're printing it. That led to us talking about the self-licking ice cream cone, which is paper 37. We talked about that 4 weeks ago. We're on paper 41 right now. And how the Federal Reserve is printing money to pay for the Treasury Department's own debt. That's what created the inflationary surge. Now we're facing a different problem because we've had so much stimulus put in the system. So let's go on. There's a couple more points. Expanding interventions that rely on debt creation or quantitative easing does not correct the private sector imbalance between consumption and production. Now, we could go back and we could go back hundreds of years on this one and start with the production function, but let's not do that. Let's just say when there's an imbalance, you can't throw capital, debt at it and correct it. Number four, negative federal funds rates for prolonged periods influence longer rates and distort risk, leading to financial bubbles. My God, what a thing to say. Are we in a Of course we're in a financial bubble because we've had the knuckleheads that run our country printing like banshees and borrowing like banshees, and then coming up with silly carnival programs to pay it back. But as long as we're joyous, we're okay, right? Oh my God, we've got to be joyous. Listen, we're on the verge of a precipitous decline in the dollar. And we're going to see these questions revisited in 2025, whoever wins the White House. I don't think it's going to matter at this stage unless we have a broad awakening in society of where we're at, which I haven't seen much signs to. And number five, persistence of fiscal and monetary stimulus in high debt environments leads to destabilization and makes economies prone to depressions and inflations. Now, depressions and inflations are symptoms of problems, right? I mean, you don't want one and you don't want the other, but you can create, it's very destabilizing to have a dependent economy on unending stimulus, unending federal spending, and printing of money. Now, right now, we're at that precipice. So I want to go back in the next few minutes of this podcast, and I want to go over what we have seen by going back in some instances to 1948, in some instances to the 1970s, and taking a look at what has happened. Now, the one thing you've got to remember, everybody is in awe of Jerome Powell. The one thing you've got to know is they have only a simple tool, and it's a two-pronged tool. One, they can move the short-term interest rate up or down. Okay, and that's what we're going to spend some time on today, because that does affect us. It affects borrowing. It affects the cost of funds. And the other thing they can do is they can print money. And my God, they went crazy during COVID printing money. Crazy. I've never seen it in my life. And I'm 75. What did I say? I shouldn't have said it. I'm 75, and I've never seen what they've done. And in the history of America, I don't know of another time that it was done like that. So they've printed a lot of money. So basically, let's take a look at their two tools. Remember, raising the short-term rate and printing money. That's all they can do. Or they can lower the short-term rate. But there are profound effects to it, and we need to understand them. I mean, you can't be that reliant on a knucklehead like Jerome Powell, a friggin' attorney, for God's sakes. I'd rather have a garbage collector talking about it than an attorney. Okay, a slick talking attorney telling us what he's done in the economy and have everybody on the seat of their chair waiting for him to speak again. Okay, and that is a phenomenon that's going to shortly end too, and it's not going to end in a pleasant way. So it's important we understand these things. So this is a very important podcast, in my opinion, because we're going to go back and take a look at these two tools. One, raising the short-term interest rate or lowering it, and two, printing money. And we're going to look at the effects of those two things. And we're going to keep in mind that when you borrow money, like I showed you on the zero graph, which is page 36 of the paper, when you borrow money to stimulate the economy, the effect of that money on growth is declining with each additional dollar you borrow. And right now we're pushing 36 trillion. Wow, 36 trillion. I thought billions were a lot of money most of my life. $36 trillion. Is the government nuts? You know, we should tar and feather everyone in the House of Representatives, Democrats and Republicans. We should tar and feather everyone in the executive branch. Maybe imprison a few just to send a message. The position they put the country in is untenable. And what are they doing? They're out on the campaign trail promising more gifts. Vote for me. I'll give you this. I'll give you that. Yeah, sure. Nobody cares about the country, believe me. So let's go back and let's look at this in time. So we know that the byproduct of increased interventions, an intervention is when the Federal Reserve does what? When the Federal Reserve moves the federal funds rate up and down and or prints money. The byproduct of increased interventions is increased debt, requiring more increased interventions, yielding more increased debt. So when we take that process, now eventually that has brought us out of some recessions. But at this moment, the choice has become limited to monetizing the debt, printing money, or reneging to pay interest owed on the debt. Both paths lead to equivalent currency debasement, the currency value dropping dramatically. We haven't had that. With this little 9% thing that everybody's choked up over is nothing compared to what is ahead of us unless we address this problem. It needs to be addressed right away. Lowering interest cost to bait more loans is not helping growth. It's not helping investment. It is stimulating, because when you lower interest cost, more people do what? More people borrow, including our U.S. Congress. I mean, if you go back, the debt was 9 trillion, 8.9 trillion when Obama came in. He took it to 19. But in the environment, the interest rates were being held artificially low. Artificially low. What does artificially low mean? Okay, think of this. You have an inflation level. Let's call it 2% a year. If you price interest, if you're pricing the interest rate, it has to be above the rate of inflation. Now, you have a time cost and a risk factor. The longer periods of time a borrower takes the money for adds a little bit to the interest rate. And you also have a risk factor, the risk of not paying it back. So the time cost of money for the Fed funds rate, let's call it 1%. Okay. So you take your 2% inflation rate and your 1% cost of funds, because they have to have a positive value. They have to be above inflation, right? So you're at 3% for an overnight loan. So then what is a reasonable 30-year mortgage cost, which there is some risk of failure? Well, let's call it 5%. And that's having money priced with a positive value. Now, when loans go out at 2% and the cost of funds are the inflation rate plus the cost of money, 1%, 3%, that is a negative rate. Even though you're only paying 2%, the cost of having money for that year leaves it flat with the inflation rate at 2%. So negative pricing of money is what occurred for many, many years this century, many years. And we're going to go on and we're going to cite some other things. We're going to touch on the 5 deflationary recessions since 1972. Okay. Now, the federal funds rate is critical. It gets all the advertisement. Today, everybody's on the edge of their seat talking about, oh my God, the Fed is on the verge of lowering the federal funds rate, which is up over 5%, right? Okay, so everybody is waiting for that. Do you know historically when that has occurred is when the markets have gone down, when unemployment has gone up? It's not a good thing. Yet everyone, all the market savvy individuals, all the talking heads are imploring the Fed to lower the federal funds rate. Well, why would you want to lower it if effectively unemployment's going to go up? It's been a signal 7 times that has preceded unemployment going up and the economy slowing down. Why would you want to lower it? Sounds stupid. Well, let's see. We'll know unfortunately, we won't know till next year because there are lags. But that's what everybody's talking about today is lowering the federal funds rate. So lowering the federal funds rate below the natural rate. And the thing you have to remember is that in the 70s and 80s, you had negative interest rates from 1970 to 1982 running for 8 years. Now, don't get confused. The interest rate was above 5%, the overnight rate, but the inflation rate was above 6 and 7 and 8 and got as high as the teens by 1981. So you didn't have a positive value, even with a 5 and 6 and 7% interest rate. You didn't have a positive value with your inflation up at 13 and 14. You had a negative value to money. Okay. So that tool has eventually worked in slowing things down. I mean, you had the 1992 brief recession, 1991-92. You had the 2001 recession. The 73-74, of course, we talked about. 81 was a severe recession. in the first year of Ronald Reagan's presidency. Now, the interesting thing Reagan did, okay, is he significantly rewrote taxes, much more than Trump did, even though Trump is full of himself when he talks about his tax cuts being the greatest. They're not the greatest. Reagan's were much greater. But his regret was he couldn't lower expenses. But what he did do in lowering taxes and not relying on government spending, he did stimulate growth. And growth did move up during Reagan's term, and it moved up to over 5%, the real rate of growth in the 4s and 5% range. Now we get up to 91, we had a brief recession. We had 3 recessions, including 91 and 01, that were not where we didn't add any people, where we had a shrinking number of labor participation. Now, there are a number of reasons for that, but the traditional model had always been that the Fed went by is that you sort of raise rates to create more unemployment, and then you lower rates and you stimulate employment. That's their game. That's been their game. It's the only tool they have. If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Everything looks like a nail. And that's the case with Powell and the Federal Reserve. So basically, the GDP did a number of things. It went sort of wimpish at the turn of this century, and labor wasn't reacting. I mean, the number of employees were essentially the same from 91 to all the way up to 07, practically. We weren't adding significant, although we added 20, 30 million to the population in that period of time. And you know, assuming that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has the same error baked in each time, they weren't catching increases in labor. So basically, you had 7 recessions, and then you had 3 of them toward the end that didn't really respect the Phillips curve. Okay. Now, part of the reason for that is we were so reliant on China and imports. In other words, the labor wasn't occurring in America, it was occurring overseas. And we were dealing with the final product, which served as a damper to our inflation. It was really a world in which we both benefited, China and America, up until 2018, 2019, actually. So it was a very beneficiary thing. And let me read. Well, I don't want to go back to the 70s again, even though they've been an interesting period. You know, so there were many periods, if you go back to even 1980 to present, little in the 70s, 40 some years, there were many periods where the Federal Reserve rate, the overnight rate, was negative. Okay. But in this century, there have been very few periods of time that it's positive. Okay. And why do you want you want a price to your money? If the Federal Reserve rate is negative and money is negative, you have no value, no price on your money, no interest rate. I mean, even if it's 3%, if your inflation's 3%, you're at 0, right? So you're charging 3% interest, but the inflation rate's 3, and 3 minus 3 equals 0. 0, right? Okay, so we've operated in a 0 zone most of this century. Now, that partly explains the rise of cryptocurrency and why the Gen Zs and millennials have flocked to cryptocurrency, much like older people flock to gold. They do it because they realize the currency is being debased through the borrowing, the printing, and artificially holding the interest rate low. Why do we want an interest rate? I mean, why do you need it? You have MMP, you have going back all the way back to Frederick Knapp, actually MMP. There's nothing modern about it. Frederick Knapp started it and sold it to the Kaiser in Germany in 1921, who who destroyed the mark by printing extra marks under MMP and sending Germany into the worst depression of any of the depressed countries, into Hitler and World War II. So you don't printing has never been a method to create value. Only investment has created value. Now, what's the difference? Why can't we just print money? Why not just print it like Ocasio-Cortez or the lefties in Congress want to do and give it out? I mean, that's pretty simple. I mean, you don't have to go to work or anything if we just print more and give it out. Well, look at it this way. Let's say we had an economy. Let's call it the Harris-Trump economy, okay? And let's say they both wanted to give $10,000 out to each individual in the system that is below 60,000. So let's say they're going to give out 150 million times $10,000. Look, and we're using round numbers. The population's 330 million. Let's say 150 million are below 60,000. So 150 million is 2 trillion, is $1.5 trillion, giving out 10,000. Actually, it's hold on, let me make sure I have the zeros right. Could be 15 trillion. 150, 2 billion, 15 billion, 150 billion. Yeah, it's 15 trillion. Okay. Okay, $15 trillion. Okay. So there are currently, as of last month, in the system of M2, which is not M3, admittedly, but it's the only thing we count ever since that trader Benedict Bernanke modified it, in 2006. In M2 is a little over $20 trillion in circulation. So they'd be giving out 15 trillion more right here. Get your check in the mail. Aren't you lucky? It's so easy. Well, everything was priced relative to that 20 trillion. The 20 trillion of so-called fiat currency of dollar bills, US dollar bills, is based on the exchange price is based on the number of dollars outstanding. So if you have 20 trillion, everything has a price. If you make it 35 trillion tomorrow morning by issuing more pieces of paper, what happens to the price? Well, the price will almost double because you've almost doubled the money supply. So tomorrow morning, everything will cost almost twice as much. See how stupid it is to just print money and think you're getting out of something? Well, that's what the Fed did in 2021, and now Jerome is trying to walk it back. I mean, he took actually Benedict Bernanke started it in 2006. He took a balance sheet of about 600 billion and ran it up to 4.5 trillion through Janet Wawa. And then when Jerome got a hold of it, he ran it up to almost 9 trillion. Now he's come back down, backing off of it to 7.1, okay, trillion. But that's still hugely larger than the balance sheet was when Benedict Bernanke got a hold of it at 600 billion back in 2006. And the effect of that had our money supply go from roughly 15 trillion in 2017 to 21.5 trillion a peak in 2022. That's an increase in money in the system of 42% uh, in a mere 5-year period. I've never seen anything like it in my life. And that's why stocks are bubblicious. That's why, incidentally, it was an effective way to transfer wealth to the wealthy. So that's what Trump's policy, with 2.3 trillion spent on COVID in 2020, and then Biden's policy, Biden-Harris, I might add, Harris gavelled down two of the biggest spending bills in history to break ties in the Senate, 1.9 trillion, their COVID relief amendment to Trump's COVID relief, and then another 1.8 trillion on their Inflation Reduction Act. Oh, are you serious? What a joke. So that was Harris whacking that gavel down and passing those spending bills. So the spending by those two has created this monstrosity of superficial demand in what I look at as wrongful investments determined by politicians, not the market, not market demand, not market supply, just by a political gavel, pure coercion, and it's our money. And guess what? We have to pay it back. Democrats and Republicans, not just one. That process, the printing of money, transferred wealth away from the middle class to the upper 1% in society. So the actual process by Trump in 2020 and by Biden for almost 4 years, by Harris administration, Kamala was gaveling away the spending right with them every day, has created this gigantic hole and has eviscerated the middle class, taking wealth, increasing the cost to the middle class by over 20%. Some items like homes are up 42 to 44%. Okay, no wonder there's a shortage, Kamala. No wonder, Joe. No wonder, Donald. You guys have been spending money out of control, out of control. So basically, that's the world we're in. And when you get to looking at the paper, and I did, and I'll make a note of it when I send it out to my list. If you don't have time to read it, to look at the executive summary, to look at the last paragraph on page 30, and to look at the chart, the 0 hour on page 36. That's very, very much tells you what $1 more in debt yields in growth. It's not a pretty story, and it's going the wrong way. And the solutions are right out of insanity. The solutions from the Harris camp, and Trump hasn't come up with a solution. He's got more tax cuts going in, but he doesn't have a solution to the debt. Harris's camp's solution will execute the activity in the economy. It will drop so quickly you'll never believe it if she gets in and passes these things, and she becomes even more reliant on government spending, which is her MO. It's clearly her MO. So with Trump, there's nothing out there, no proposed solution, no discussion. With Harris, there's a very destructive discussion, and they're climbing up the wrong tree, and they're going to kill the U.S. economy very quickly. You reach a point when you become reliant on debt to stimulate and low interest rates. You reach a point where your money value cascades down, and guess what happens to the interest rate? Remember at the beginning we said interest rate was a function of three components, that it had to exceed inflation, it had a time value to it, longer borrowing of rates was a little higher than shorter borrowing, and a third factor, it's a function of risk. risk, the risk of repayment. If that moves in to the American equation, oh, Katie, bar the door. Interest rates are going to shoot up quite a bit. And so we're in between, we're at a rock and a hard place with the nation. People need to understand this. I'm not, we call the program Sunshine and Transparency because there's nothing wrong with the truth. It may not be what you want to hear, but you just need to understand it if you have a chance to deal with it. Because if you don't fully understand it, you're not going to deal with it the right way. And in coming weeks, we're going to talk about scrapping the entire tax code and coming up with some ideas there, and also what we can do with expenses because we're out of control. We're totally out of control. Now, I'm pretty much out of time this Sunday. I probably worn you out. So the price of money will be posted. The podcast will be posted later tonight. Future weeks, we're going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about scrapping the whole tax code. We're going to talk about First Amendment too. First Amendment gives me the right to talk to you. I mean, isn't it great? We still have that right. How much longer are we going to have it? How has that right changed recently? Has it changed for the better or the worse? These are things when we discuss First Amendment we're going to get into. Right now, I want to tell you to have a blessed week. And I want to tell you that I'm enjoying this. Hopefully, we're going to build up enough viewers to maintain it. In any case, good to see you. Look forward to seeing you next week. Talk later. Have a blessed